Hi again, welcome to review for the Chem 4 final exam, concepts behind determining the pH of a salt. Now acids make an acid solution, bases make a basic solution, salts in water can either produce neutral, acidic, or basic pH, so they're a little bit more complicated to handle than a straight acid or base. We've covered pH of strong acid or base, pH of weak acid or base, so we're doing pH of a salt. Remember conjugate acids and bases? Well, they're back. Conjugates show up in salts. When an acid loses a hydrogen, you know that makes a conjugate base. The layer we're adding on in this video is when a strong acid loses a hydrogen, the conjugate base will be a weaker base than water. When a conjugate is weaker than water, the water sets the pH value, not the conjugate. I'm going to repeat that. When a conjugate is weaker than water, the pH is set by the water. And what's the pH of water? 7. So the pH is set by the water, 7. And here you'll learn in our pH song later on, if it's a weaker than water conjugate, then pH equals 7. You'll learn the whole song later. That was just a little taste. Okay, so for example, if we start with a strong acid, hydrochloric acid, and we lose this hydrogen to water, then we're left with Cl minus, because it's lost a positive charge, plus that H3O plus, which we write as H plus. So this strong acid has become a conjugate base. Is that conjugate base a stronger base than water? Since it's coming from a strong acid, the conjugate base is weak. If the conjugate base is weaker than water, right away, without any calculations, we know the pH of that solution. Oh, we didn't do the, if we see that conjugate base in a salt, like NaCl, since the Cl comes from the strong acid HCl, we know if you put sodium chloride in water, the pH is going to equal 7. It's like when you put salt in water. It's not going to hurt you because the pH is neutral. Okay, so now let's move on to when you put a weak acid or base. When a weak acid loses a hydrogen, we know when an acid loses a hydrogen, it becomes a conjugate base. The new layer is when a weak acid loses a hydrogen, then the conjugate base will be stronger than water. So if this base is stronger than water, then the base, the conjugate base, is what's going to set the pH of the solution. So when you have a weak acid or base, and you see the conjugate in a salt, let's do an example. We just did weak. Oh. For example, here's our weak acid. If it loses a hydrogen, we're left with CH3COO minus. If you see this, and since this is a weak acid, this is a stronger than water conjugate base.
Why is it a weak acid?
It's a weak acid because it's not in the strong acid song. Thank you for asking, sis. So if we see this conjugate in a salt, for example, NaCH3COO, we know that this conjugate base came from this acid. We know it's a base because it's negative. Well, where did it come from? A strong or a weak? This is a base, so it came from an acid. Add an H to it to see what acid it came from. You add an H and it's CH3COOH, not in our strong acid song. So we know the initial acid was weak, therefore its conjugate base is stronger than water. So this conjugate base is going to set the pH. So when you have a salt that contains a conjugate acid or base from a weak acid or base, the pH will equal 7. But if the salt contains the conjugate acid or base from a, I got it backwards, contains a conjugate acid or base from a strong, sorry about that. If the salt contains a conjugate acid or base from a strong acid, then you're going to get weak conjugates, weaker than water. Then the pH is set by the water. But when the salt contains a conjugate acid or base from a weak acid or weak base, then that conjugate is stronger than water, and therefore it will react with water. So what you're going to see in these cases where our conjugate is stronger than water, you're going to take that salt and react it with the water. And it will act as the stronger than water base, in which case the water is the acid, or the stronger than water acid, in which case the water is the acid. So our next video we'll look at some examples of this. See you then.